You wake up one morning at 65, and for a brief second, everything feels still until a quiet terror creeps in. You've lived more years explaining yourself than actually being yourself. It doesn't strike like lightning. It arrives like fog, slow, silent, and suffocating. You look back and realize that most of your life has been a series of performances, carefully worded sentences, softened truths, smiles you didn't mean, boundaries you never voiced. You were not dishonest. You were surviving. Because somewhere along the way, someone taught you that being accepted was safer than being whole. And so, like many, you put on the mask Carl Jung called this the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate the demands of society. He believed it was necessary in early life, but dangerous when mistaken for the self. And now, at 65, the persona no longer fits. It cracks, it sags, it suffocates. The weight of decades of explanation has worn thin your patience, and the mask begins to fall. You start remembering every moment you tried to justify your feelings, every time you apologized for crying, every time you downplayed your pain to make others more comfortable, every time you were gaslit into thinking your emotions were too much or not enough. And the worst part, you thought that if you just explained yourself clearly enough, they would finally get it. That someday someone would finally say, "Now I see you." But that day never came. Take the story of a man named Elias, now 70. He was the youngest of 5 brothers, always the peacemaker. At family dinners, he played the role perfectly. He made the jokes, he diffused the tension, he excused the cruelty of others because they didn't mean it like that. For decades, he tried to be the one everyone liked, but behind the scenes, he swallowed every insult, buried every slight, and explained every betrayal away. They're family, he told himself. They'll come around. But they never did. And one day, as he sat alone in a cafe watching a family laugh at the next table, he realized he had built his life hoping to be understood by people who never even tried to understand him. That grief didn't scream. It whispered, and it changed him. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But Elias, like many, had never claimed that privilege. Why? Because he spent too many years explaining, justifying, minimizing, editing. He lived waiting for a permission slip that never arrived and never would. Here lies the great irony. The people you hope will understand you are often the least equipped to do so. Not because you are too complex, but because they are too distracted by their own masks. You are not hard to love. You were just surrounded by those who hadn't yet learned how to see past their own reflection. The misunderstanding you feel isn't just personal, it's psychological. Jung believed that when we explain ourselves excessively, we are often trying to project our unmet need for self-recognition onto others. We want them to validate what we have never fully claimed, but as we grow older, the psyche becomes less willing to participate in this charade. The shadow begins to stir. The soul wants reunion. At 65, a threshold appears. You can continue explaining yourself, or you can begin understanding yourself, but you cannot do both. This is your hidden mirror moment. The reflection staring back is no longer the mask, the role, or the obligation. It is the self that's been waiting, not to be explained, not to be rescued, but to be reclaimed, because no one is coming to save you from the misunderstanding you carry. This is the moment you take back the years you lost. You don't realize the mask is on until it starts suffocating you. When you were younger, survival came first, and survival meant being liked, being safe, being acceptable. So you learned to play the part the world applauded, polite, agreeable, forgiving. You laughed at jokes that hurt you. You kept peace at the cost of your voice. You bent yourself into shapes just to avoid rejection. You weren't being fake, you were being strategic. The world rewarded obedience, not truth. And somewhere along the way, your performance became your personality. Carl Jung called this version of you the persona, the mask you present to the world. But he warned us, the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. In other words, it's the costume you wear, so others won't see your rawness, your realness, but masks age badly. One evening, during a family gathering, his brother joked, "Ray's always been the safe one. Never takes a risk, never makes a scene." Everyone laughed except Ray. This time, he didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He didn't say, "It's okay." He just stood up, walked to the kitchen, and stared out the window. Something cracked. It wasn't rage. It wasn't resentment. It was realization. "I've spent a lifetime trying to impress someone who can't even see me," he whispered to himself. That was the moment his shadow stepped forward, not to destroy him, but to liberate him. You see, the shadow does not rise to punish. It rises to protect. It is the part of you that watched you give everything to people who gave nothing back. It remembers every moment you were overlooked, overruled, overworked, and as you grow older, it starts whispering louder. You spent your life pleasing people who wouldn't lift a finger for you. You forgave people who never apologized. You waited for love from those who gave you crumbs. At first, these whispers feel like bitterness, but they are not. They are clarity, and clarity always feels dangerous to those who built their lives on denial. The dramatic irony is this. The shadow you feared your whole life, the part you thought would make you unlovable, is actually the part of you that loves you enough to fight for your truth. It refuses to let you die unknown, unexpressed, unseen. Have you ever had a moment where the mask slipped and what came out shocked even you? A boundary you never thought you'd set. A truth you never thought you'd speak. A silence you never thought you'd break. That wasn't weakness. That wasn't losing control. That was your shadow trying to keep you from vanishing. In Jung's view, integration of the shadow is not about defeating it. It's about befriending it, welcoming the truth it carries, listening to what it has always known. So when you feel that rising emotion, that strange anger, that trembling truth, don't suppress it. Listen. It may be the first honest thing you've felt in years, because the shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of you that refuses to die unknown. Your shadow knows the truth you've been avoiding for years. What if the person you've been waiting to understand you was never even looking? That question alone can collapse decades of hope in an instant. Carl Jung believed that projection, the unconscious act of placing our own unresolved emotions, unlived potential, and wounded needs onto others, is not just a defense mechanism. It is a trap, and it becomes more dangerous the older we get. Because the longer you wait for someone else to get you, the more likely it is you've been using their eyes as a mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of the self you haven't fully owned. Jung taught, we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. But most people never realize how many of those disguises are people they've loved or chased, or tried to fix, or tried to impress. Think of projection like this. You don't just want your partner, your child, or your friend to understand you. You want them to give you back a version of yourself you're too afraid to claim directly. You want their acceptance because you've never given yourself permission to accept your own truth. Take the story of Richard, a soft-spoken retired professor, now 70. For most of his adult life, he idolized his best friend, Tony. Tony was bold, successful, unapologetic. Richard, on the other hand, was the nice guy, the helper, the reliable listener. But inside, Richard longed to be seen, not as the agreeable friend, but as the man who had ideas worth fighting for. Every time Tony interrupted him in conversation or dismissed his opinions with a laugh, Richard smiled. But something inside him tightened. For 40 years, he told himself, Tony doesn't mean harm. He just doesn't understand me. But one afternoon at a lunch table in their old university cafe, Richard asked Tony if he had ever once read any of the essays he wrote. Essays Richard spent a lifetime refining. Tony laughed and said, "Why would I? I already know what you think." That moment shattered Richard's illusion Tony never misunderstood him. He had never tried to understand him at all. The pain wasn't just about Tony's response. It was about the decades Richard had wasted projecting his need for recognition onto someone who never had the capacity or the interest to reflect it. This is the brutal reality of projection. You're not waiting to be seen. You are waiting to see yourself reflected in someone else's validation, and most people spend their whole lives standing in that waiting room. That's why projection is the greatest thief of old age. It robs you of your time, your clarity, your self-trust. It convinces you that someone else holds the final word on your worth. You think, if they finally hear me, I will heal. If they finally see me, I will rest. If they finally understand me, I will feel whole. But these are illusions, shadows cast on the wall of your own unmet needs, and the moment you realize that, something shifts inside you. A door opens where a wall used to be. Maria, 72, learned this too, after 40 years of trying to explain her emotions to a cold and distant husband. Every time she opened her heart, he responded with silence or sarcasm. She thought, maybe I'm not saying it right. Maybe if I explain it better. But one day, in the middle of a familiar argument, Maria said nothing. She simply looked at him and saw for the first time that he wasn't confused. He just didn't care to understand. That moment didn't destroy her, it freed her. Because when you stop projecting your inner wounds onto someone else's shoulders, you stop waiting, and when you stop waiting, you begin living. The great irony of projection is that it begins with hope and ends with grief, but it is a sacred kind of grief. It's the grief that lets you bury the illusion and reclaim your truth. You are not broken because someone failed to understand you. You are broken by the years you spent expecting them to. And once you stop asking others to carry what you abandoned in yourself, the healing begins. The one who must understand you first is you. They say dreams are meaningless, but what if they're the only place where the truth dares to speak? In Jungian psychology, dreams are not random. They are letters written by your unconscious, sealed in symbols, and delivered each night to your sleeping mind. Jung believed the dream world is where the persona sleeps, and the shadow wakes. It's the one place your masks can't follow you. And after 65, when the distractions of youth quiet down, these dreams begin to speak louder, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in warnings. If you're over 65, you may have noticed a shift. Your dreams are no longer wild or chaotic. They're strangely focused. An old house, a locked door, a silent child waiting by the window. You wake with a chill, not from fear, but from recognition. These aren't just dreams. They are maps to the parts of you that life forgot. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And what better messenger than a dream, a nightly invitation to reunite with the self you left behind? Let's consider Harold, a retired teacher now 71. Every few weeks, he dreams of an attic filled with dusty boxes. Each box is labeled with a name, but when he reaches to open one, the floorboards creak and he wakes up. It haunted him for months. What did the attic mean? Why the boxes? Why the fear? In a quiet therapy session, something clicked. The boxes were his journals, thoughts he never shared, emotions he never voiced, truths he boxed away to keep peace in his marriage, in his family, in his career. The attic wasn't fantasy. It was memory. His own mind was trying to bring him back to himself. That's the nature of dreams in later life. They stop distracting. They start pointing to the places you locked up, the door you never opened, the version of you that stood knocking for 40 years, but you were too busy explaining yourself to hear him. And here's the twist. The symbols don't change until you do. Another woman, Elena, wrote at 70 that she kept dreaming of a boy knocking on a door that never opened, over and over. The same boy, the same door. At first, she thought it was just sadness. Then one day she realized. The boy was her, the child who kept waiting to be understood. The door didn't open because she was waiting for someone else to open it, from the outside. But what if the key was always in her pocket? Dreams speak in riddles, not to confuse you, but to protect you. Because sometimes the truth is too sharp to face directly. So it comes dressed as symbols, as hallways, as keys, as rooms you forgot you built. Dramatic irony lives here too. You spent decades chasing understanding from others, not knowing your own mind was begging you to understand yourself. And if you've ever dreamed of being lost, abandoned, running, or left behind, that's not fantasy. That's your shadow calling for reunion, not to shame you, to reclaim you. But here's where it turns. When you dream of unlocking something, a gate, a drawer, a sealed room, that is not random, that is your true self telling you. The wait is over. Stop hoping someone else will find the key, because they won't, because they were never meant to. Only you can turn the handle. Only you can open the door. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." Your dreams are not asking you to be understood. They're asking you to understand yourself at last. So the next time you wake with a strange feeling, ask yourself, what part of me is trying to speak? What have I ignored? What door am I standing in front of, but still waiting for someone else to open? Because there's a boy knocking, or a girl, or a younger self who still believes someone's coming. But tonight, maybe you finally realize they've been waiting on you. Your dreams have been telling you the truth you refuse to speak aloud. There comes a quiet moment in some lives, not loud, not dramatic, when an older man or woman walks into a room and everything shifts. They don't raise their voice, they don't explain, they don't beg to be heard, but suddenly people stop talking. They notice, they listen, and they don't know why. This is not about age, it's about archetype. Carl Jung believed that when we grow older, we are meant to step into a new energy, one that doesn't argue, doesn't chase, doesn't perform. He called it the archetype of the elder, and most people never claim it. Instead, they stay trapped in the old roles they built to survive. The pleaser, the fixer, the invisible child. They keep seeking approval from those who never gave it. They keep justifying their worth to people who never really looked at them. They keep performing in relationships where the script was never written for their freedom. But the elder, the true elder, is not a performer. He is a presence. He has walked through enough storms to know what matters. He has outlived the lies of his youth. And when he enters the room, he carries truth like gravity. He doesn't have to raise it. It pulls everything down to earth on its own. Take the story of Hassan. He was 69, newly retired, once a respected manager at a large engineering firm. At work, people listened when he spoke. They took notes. They waited for his guidance. But at home, it was different. His adult children often ignored him. His wife interrupted him at dinner. His youngest son rolled his eyes during conversations. For a while, Hassan kept trying, offering advice, sharing stories, reminding them of his experience. But every word seemed to fall into a void. One day, during a family argument, his son accused him of always trying to control everything. The irony stung. Hassan had spent his entire life avoiding control. He only wanted to be included, to be heard. That's when something snapped. Or rather, something unlocked. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He didn't list his sacrifices or explain his intentions. He simply said, "I'm done trying to prove my value." You will either recognize it or you won't, but I'm done begging." And then he walked out of the room. That sentence shattered the entire dynamic. His wife sat in silence. His son stared, unsure of what had just happened, because in that moment they were no longer speaking to the man they knew. They were facing the elder. The archetype had entered the room, and it carried more weight than years of explanations ever could. Jung believed that the elder was not a role you inherit just by aging, it is a truth you remember. The moment you stop trying to earn your place in other people's narratives is the moment you step into your own. He wrote, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie." The elder is not just a wise figure, he is a mirror, a disruptor, a quiet force. He sees through masks because he spent decades wearing one. He no longer reacts to manipulation, he simply removes himself. He no longer explains his truth, he embodies it. And this power terrifies people who are still stuck in their performance roles. They don't know how to engage with someone who doesn't play the game. They accuse the elder of being cold or distant, but in truth, the elder has simply stopped trading his dignity for attention. Have you ever seen this happen? A father, a grandmother, a friend who one day just stopped chasing closeness, and suddenly everyone realized how far they had let things fall. That's not a loss of love. That's the rise of the archetype. Because when the elder stops explaining, the world around him rearranges. You're not here to beg for respect. You're here to remember the power you always had, but only now have the wisdom to use. The moment you become the elder, you stop needing permission to exist. They don't misunderstand you because you're complicated. They misunderstand you because they're still wearing a mask. This is one of Carl Jung's most brutal but liberating insights. Most people do not see you clearly because they cannot even see themselves. The human mind is wired to defend its image, not reveal its truth. And when someone hasn't faced their own inner world, their shadow, their shame, their unmet needs, they will always misinterpret yours. Not because you're unclear, but because their perception is distorted by self-protection. Imagine a man named Victor. He's 66. He's worked in the same office for 32 years. Calm, reliable, soft-spoken. People describe him as easygoing. But what they don't know is that Victor has spent 3 decades swallowing his ideas in meetings where louder voices won. He's had visions, insights, quiet wisdom, but every time he shared something, his manager would nod and say, "Thanks, Victor," before turning to someone else. Dismissed, not because Victor made no sense, but because his clarity threatened the personas around him. The manager couldn't face his own insecurity, so he masked it with silence. His colleagues feared being outshined by Victor's quiet depth, so they labeled him as nice but forgettable. That's how the ego works. It twists what it cannot face. Jung warned us of this. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But most people never follow that path. Instead of asking, "Why does this bother me?" they blame the person who mirrors what they've ignored inside. Now pause here and ask yourself, how many times have you been misunderstood not because of what you said, but because of what someone else couldn't face? A friend who keeps cutting you off isn't confused by your story. They're protecting their persona of being the center of attention. A partner who invalidates your feelings doesn't need more clarity. They need to protect the fragile image they have of themselves as the reasonable one. A boss who laughs at your feedback isn't unaware. They're threatened by anything that punctures the illusion of control. This is projection, one of the central ideas in Jung's psychology. When people haven't integrated their own shadow, they project it onto others. They accuse you of being too sensitive because they are emotionally numb. They call you selfish because they've abandoned their own needs for so long. They label you dramatic because your truth exposes their silence. So the question is no longer, why don't they understand me? The real question is, why do I expect a blind person to notice the light? This is where the pain ends and the wisdom begins. Because when you accept that most people are not emotionally mature enough to truly see you, you stop twisting yourself into explanations. You stop rehearsing speeches in your head. You stop trying to say things in just the right way. You realize that even your clearest truth will be misheard by a closed heart, and this realization does not make you bitter. It makes you free. It frees you from the illusion that your peace depends on someone else's perception. It frees you from the performance of trying to be understandable to someone who refuses to understand themselves. This is the doorway to individuation, Jung's term for becoming whole. The moment you stop projecting your need for validation onto people still hiding behind masks, you step into your own true character. Let's go back to Victor. One day, during yet another meeting where his idea was ignored, he didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply stood, walked out, and requested a transfer to a department where he could lead. The silence he left behind shook the room more than any speech ever could, because when you stop needing to be understood, your energy stops leaking, your presence becomes undeniable. So ask yourself this: have you ever stayed silent to avoid explaining yourself again? Because here's the truth Jung was trying to teach us, not just in theory, but in the architecture of our daily lives. You were never hard to understand. They were just unwilling to remove their mask. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. You've spent your entire life learning how to explain yourself to parents who never listened, to partners who never saw you, to children who outgrew your voice but not your sacrifices. For years, you were the narrator of your own defense. You'd rehearse your tone, your timing, your words, all in the hope that this time, maybe they would finally understand. But what if explanation was never the answer? What if the moment you stop explaining is the moment people show you who they really are? Carl Jung believed that the persona, the mask we wear to fit into society, becomes thicker with every explanation we give to avoid conflict, rejection, or shame. And sometimes, that mask is not just on you, it's on them too, which means they're not rejecting the real you, they're defending the version of themselves that cannot handle your truth. Let's make this real. Picture a retired teacher named Alan. He's 70, quiet, thoughtful. He spent a lifetime teaching children how to find their voice. But at home, he rarely used his own, especially not around his grown sons, both high-achieving, both impatient with anything emotional. One Sunday, at a family lunch, Alan shares something gentle but personal. He says, "Sometimes I feel like a guest in my own family, like I raised a home that no longer remembers my voice." His sons laugh awkwardly. One rolls his eyes. The other scoffs, "Come on, Dad. Not everything has to be so dramatic." Years ago, Alan would have tried to soften the blow, walk it back, or explain, "I didn't mean it like that. I was just saying." But not this time. This time, he stays still. He sips his tea. He says nothing, and something shifts. The son who laughed grows defensive. He changes the subject. The one who scoffed grows irritated. "Why are you being so quiet now?" they ask, as if silence is more confrontational than words. Because it is. Silence is not passive. It is not weakness. It is a mirror. And the moment you stop performing explanations, people are left with nothing to react to except their own reflection. In Alan's silence, his sons confronted something uncomfortable, their inability to sit with another's truth without needing to distort it. Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." That's why silence is so revealing. It doesn't provoke, it exposes. Think of all the times you were talked over at dinner tables, dismissed in arguments, gaslit in gentle tones. Think of how often you let it slide, not because you agreed, but because you were tired of proving your worth, tired of translating your pain, tired of begging for the bare minimum. Respect. But something changes when you cross 65. You realize you've explained yourself for decades, and it didn't make people understand you. It just made them comfortable ignoring you. So what if you tried something else? What if, the next time someone twisted your words, you just let them sit in the silence? What if, instead of defending your truth, you simply let it echo, untouched, unargued, unrevised? Watch what happens. The ones who respect you will slow down. They will listen. They might even return to the conversation with a softer heart. But the ones who only ever valued your silence, not your truth, will show their discomfort. They'll fidget. They'll criticize your tone. They'll accuse you of being cold, distant, too quiet, when in reality, you're simply done begging to be heard. This is dramatic irony at its finest. For years, they claimed to want your honesty, but the moment you gave it without decoration, they couldn't handle the echo. That is the moment silence becomes your power. Because silence isn't empty, it's full of everything you no longer owe. And the next part of the story begins with that shift, the subtle but profound change that happens inside you the moment you stop giving your energy to the wrong audience. Silence is the mirror where true character is exposed. There's a strange kind of power that enters the room when someone speaks less and means more. You've seen it before. A quiet person who doesn't rush to defend themselves, who doesn't explain every decision, who simply lives in the certainty of their own truth. That stillness, that presence. It's not weakness, it's mastery. And it almost always arrives late in life, after years of trying to be understood, years of wasting breath, years of watching people listen only to what they wanted to hear. Carl Jung understood this shift well. He believed that when we stop explaining ourselves, we stop leaking our energy. And that's the moment we start becoming whole. Most people don't realize how much of their emotional power is spent trying to justify who they are. They walk into rooms already preparing speeches, bracing for judgment, anticipating rejection, rehearsing ways to win approval. They think that if they explain well enough, they'll finally be seen clearly. But the truth? The people who love you don't need your explanations, and the ones who demand them aren't really listening. They're just measuring you against their own fears. This is the core of Jung's insight. Explanation becomes emotional debt. Every time you explain yourself to avoid judgment, you're borrowing self-worth from someone else's opinion. But what if you stopped? What if you simply said what you meant and let silence do the rest? Jung called this transformation individuation, the process of becoming your true self by withdrawing energy from the wrong places. The persona you built, the polite mask you wore, the performance you perfected, they all start to dissolve the moment you realize you owe no one a justification for your being. And that's when something incredible happens. Your dignity returns. Your words begin to land differently. The same boundaries you used to defend now echo with calm strength, not desperation. You become someone others take seriously, not because you raise your voice, but because your silence now carries weight. Imagine a woman named Lila. She's 67, warm-hearted, thoughtful, always explaining. Especially to her younger sister, Dana, a woman who interrupts, rolls her eyes, dismisses every emotional truth Lila tries to share. For decades, Lila rehearsed her words before every call. She'd start calm, trying to explain why something hurt. Dinah would scoff, say, "You're overthinking it," and Lila would spiral into more explaining, trying to prove that her feelings were valid. One day, after another exhausting phone call, Lila stood in her kitchen and said out loud, "I understand myself, that is enough." She didn't say it with anger. She said it like a woman putting down a heavy suitcase she'd been carrying for 40 years. The next time Dana picked a fight, Lila didn't defend. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just said, "I hear you," and ended the call. Dana panicked. She called back. She texted. "Why are you being cold?" she demanded. But Lila wasn't being cold. She was being whole. For the first time, her silence wasn't confusion, it was clarity. That moment marked the end of Lila's emotional debt. And ironically, for the first time, Dana began to feel her absence and respect her presence. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Because once you do, you stop selling pieces of yourself for understanding. You stop begging to be seen through other people's fog. You start showing up as someone who does not need to be explained, just witnessed your mask fades. Your shadow returns, not as an enemy, but as a protector. You begin to walk through life with the quiet intensity of someone who no longer performs, and others feel it. They may not understand it, but they feel it. And that changes everything. So ask yourself, how many times have you talked yourself into invisibility, trying to explain your truth to someone who had already made up their mind? How many hours have you spent rehearsing words that never landed? And how would your energy shift if you simply stopped? Power does not come from being understood. It comes from understanding yourself. There is a strange kind of freedom that arrives not with celebration, but with silence, the moment you stop trying to make anyone understand you. Most people spend their lives explaining why they stayed, why they left, why they didn't fight harder, why they were too tired to argue, why they never said what they really meant. It becomes a second language, the language of justification, a quiet, endless effort to convince others, "Please, see me the way I see myself." But here's the part no one warns you about. The longer you keep explaining, the more you begin to disappear. Carl Jung believed this disappearance wasn't accidental. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that privilege is stolen every time you feel the need to explain your soul, just to feel worthy of being heard." Explanation, Jung said, is often a form of control, a desperate attempt to shape how others see you, to manage their perception so you can finally rest. But rest never comes that way. Why? Because the peace you're searching for doesn't exist in their mind. It exists in yours. Let's make this real. Picture a man named Gerard, 73 years old. He survived a war, built a family, led a company, and lost more than he's ever spoken aloud. But with his son, 30 years younger, he still finds himself explaining every decision he's ever made. Why he wasn't at the game, why he worked late, why he didn't say, "I love you" enough. And every time, the son listens, but doesn't really hear. One day, Gerard visits him. They talk, tension rising like smoke in a quiet room. The son says, "You never made me feel important." And for the first time, Gerard doesn't explain. He just looks at him and replies, "You may never understand what I carried." And I'm finally okay with that. That sentence, simple, soft, and raised, shifted everything. It wasn't permission. It wasn't closure. It was release. Gerard didn't win the conversation. He didn't change his son's mind. But he walked out of that house 20 pounds lighter. Why? Because explanation had become a debt. And that day, he stopped paying it. This is what Jung called individuation, the psychological process where the true self detaches from the roles, masks, and perceptions imposed by others. When you let go of the need to be seen a certain way, you stop clinging to their gaze like it's your oxygen. Imagine the ripple. You wake up one morning and no longer rehearse imaginary arguments in your head. You stop editing your story to make it palatable. You stop writing letters no one will read. You stop wondering if your truth is too much. That's not weakness. That's arrival. People often say life gets easier after 65, but Jung would disagree. It's not easier, it's cleaner. You trim the psychological weight, you bury the persona. You listen to the shadow, you stop trying to get the world to clap for your survival, and instead, you sit with it, hold it, and finally say, I made it. And here's the twist. Once you stop explaining, you become more visible than ever. Because the real you finally walks into the room. The one without apologies, the one without edits, the one who doesn't shrink to be understood. So ask yourself, how many years have you been managing your image like a fragile sculpture, afraid it would shatter under someone's misunderstanding? What if you let it fall? What if you stepped through the wreckage and stood as you are, unfiltered, unafraid? Because this is what true freedom feels like. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply quiet. A kind of silence that wraps around your spine and says, we're done proving, now we live. And that silence, that is when the world finally sees the version of you that explanation kept hidden. Freedom begins the day you no longer explain your existence. There is a strange kind of peace that only comes after heartbreak. Not the heartbreak of losing love, but the quieter, more invisible heartbreak of never being fully seen. And when that heartbreak finally settles, it leaves behind something extraordinary. Space. Space to breathe, to reflect, to finally see yourself without the fog of needing others. To Carl Jung once said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But most people never get that far. They are too busy trying to be accepted by someone else. Their lives become a performance, a long rehearsal for a play where the audience never claps. They just critique, correct, or look away. And for decades, you might have played your role. The good daughter, the steady father, the quiet friend, the agreeable spouse. Always explaining, always softening your truth so it wouldn't upset the people who claim to love you. But something happens when you turn 65. The audience begins to thin. The stage starts to rot. And in the stillness, a question begins to rise. Why am I still trying to be understood by people who never tried to understand themselves? Let me tell you about Mira, a woman who turned 70 and realized she had spent her entire adult life explaining herself to her younger sister. Every holiday, every phone call, every tension between them ended the same way, Mira trying to justify why she made certain choices, why she never married, why she changed careers in her 40s, why she distanced herself from their toxic uncle. And every time, her sister would dismiss her with a passive-aggressive smile or say something like, well, I guess you've always been the dramatic one. Then one day, something inside Mira broke, but not in a tragic way. She simply didn't respond. Her sister made another loaded comment, and Mira looked up from her tea and said, I no longer owe you an explanation for a life you never had the courage to live. She didn't shout, she didn't cry. She just let go. And in that moment, something profound happened. The tension that had ruled their relationship for 50 years vanished. Her sister tried to re-engage the script. Mira didn't play along, because the script only works when you read your lines. And Mira had finally gone off book. This is what happens when you stop needing to be understood. Your mind stops rehearsing arguments. Your body stops bracing for judgment. Your soul stops crouching to fit inside other people's comfort zones. And what's left? You, just you, in your raw, unpolished, sacred truth. The version of yourself that never needed to explain why you were different, only the version that needed permission to be whole. Jung called this the return of the self. When the persona begins to slip and the shadow no longer needs to be hidden, the real self, the one you buried beneath years of people-pleasing, begins to rise, and with it comes clarity. You begin to see the roles you played out of survival, the scripts you memorized to avoid abandonment, the friendships that only worked when you were agreeable, the family dynamics that relied on your silence, and one by one you begin to release them. Letting go of being understood isn't just about freeing yourself from others. It's about reclaiming the energy you gave away, trying to earn love that should have been unconditional. That energy, once lost to worry and approval, returns to you like a tide that was always yours. You find yourself reading books you love, saying no without guilt, walking away from conversations that drain you, and even laughing at things that once made you cry. Because now you understand what Jung meant when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." There is no fate in being misunderstood. There is only the consequence of self-abandonment. And when you end that cycle, when you finally stop offering footnotes for your life story, the world inside you opens like a door you forgot was even there. And perhaps the greatest irony is this: the moment you stop trying to be understood is when some people finally start to see you. But by then, you no longer need them to. Because that longing, that exhausting, aching need to be understood, no longer drives you. Something deeper does. Something quieter. Something real. Have you ever felt the peace that comes from not explaining yourself? You gain your life back when you stop needing others to confirm who you are. What if the person you were meant to be never died, just fell asleep beneath years of pleasing, proving, and pretending? Carl Jung called the final and most important stage of life individuation. Not a rebellion, not a breakdown, but a breakthrough. It is the slow, powerful unraveling of the false self you wore to survive, and the return of the original self you abandoned along the way. Most people only reach this point after 65, not because the truth wasn't always available, but because they were too entangled in what Jung called the persona, the mask you create to be liked, needed, accepted. But over time, that mask stops fitting, and one day it begins to suffocate. Individuation begins the moment you ask, "What part of me did I bury just to be loved?" Let me tell you a story. A man named Joel spent 30 years married to a woman who claimed to love him, but only when he was quiet, agreeable, easy to manage. Over time, Joel began to erase himself to keep the peace. He gave up singing, though it was once his passion. He stopped debating politics, though he loved critical thinking. He even changed how he laughed, softer, quieter, because she once told him his real laugh was too much. Friends noticed Joel shrinking over the years. They thought he was just mellowing with age. But what they didn't see was the silent war inside him, a war between who he had become and who he used to be. After the divorce, something strange happened. Joel didn't cry. He didn't rage. He didn't collapse. He breathed. He walked into an old music store one day, touched a worn-down guitar, and said to the shopkeeper, "I haven't played in 30 years. I used to be someone else." And with trembling hands, he played a song he hadn't touched since his 20s. He wept by the third chord, not because of the loss, but because of the return. "I'm not becoming someone new," he told a friend. "I'm becoming the person I hid." That is individuation. Jung believed this process was sacred, the soul's slow emergence from behind the armor of adaptation. The persona had protected you, the shadow had haunted you, but now you're ready to integrate both and become whole. And it's not always grand. Sometimes individuation looks like saying no without guilt. Sometimes it looks like eating alone and enjoying your own company. Sometimes it's deleting old voicemails that once held you hostage. It is not loud, it is not violent, it is not flashy, but it is irreversible. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But most people never claim that privilege because they are still trying to fit into a shape the world demanded decades ago. But now you see the illusion. The people you tried to impress, they never really saw you. The rooms you stayed small in, they never grew to make space for you, the love you begged for. It never came with peace. And now, you don't want to be understood. You want to be free. You look in the mirror and whisper, "I'm coming back for you." Not with rage, not with apology, just with truth. Because you are not becoming a different person, you are becoming real. Have you ever felt like you abandoned a part of yourself just to be accepted? Individuation is not becoming different. It is becoming real. There comes a moment, often quiet, often invisible to others, when a person realizes they have lived an entire life waiting for something that will never come. That moment is not loud like heartbreak. It's quieter, heavier, like a slow exhale after holding your breath for 60 years. It comes after you've said everything you could, explained yourself in every way imaginable, waited for the apology that never came, and replayed old conversations 1,000 times. That moment, the one that feels like defeat, is actually the beginning of something sacred. Carl Jung believed that the most tragic thing a person can do is look for themselves in other people's eyes. For decades, you tried. You thought if they finally understood you, your heart, your pain, your dreams, you would feel whole. You handed out blueprints of your soul, hoping someone would read them, but they never did. And now, at the edge of your later years, a truth emerges so clearly it almost hurts. The tragedy was never that they didn't understand you. The tragedy was that you waited so long for them to. Take the story of Elaine, a retired music teacher who spent 40 years married to a man who never truly listened. She played piano late into the night, not for beauty, but for someone to ask, "What are you feeling?" That question never came. Her children loved her but misunderstood her silence. Her friends adored her humor but never saw her grief. So she explained, again and again. Until one morning at 71 she stopped, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. She sat at the piano and played for herself for the first time. No audience, no performance, no explanation. She cried, not because she was sad, but because for the first time she felt real. Jung called this moment the return of the true self, the buried core, finally breaking through the surface after decades of pretending. That self is not loud, it does not beg, it does not seek, it simply is. It carries no need to be explained or justified. It does not ask for love. It embodies it. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung said, is to become who you truly are. Most never reach that privilege, not because they couldn't, but because they spent their lives arguing with mirrors that never reflected them honestly. This is the moment where your old story ends, not with a bang, but with a breath, the moment you stop waiting to be seen and begin seeing. When you stop explaining, you reclaim all the parts of you that were given away in exchange for approval. You pick up the fragments of your truth, your opinions, your desires, your voice, and hold them with reverence. It doesn't mean your life was wasted. It means this is your awakening. This is where it starts. This is the day you stop shrinking to fit inside someone else's understanding. And here's the irony. The moment you stop needing to be understood is the moment the world finally begins to see who you really are. Not the edited version, not the polite version, but the real, dignified, whole version, the one that never needed validation to exist. So if you're over 65, this is not your ending, this is your beginning. This is where your life becomes yours again, not through louder explanations, but through quieter self-respect. Not through changing them, but through finding you, because the world does not need to understand you. You need to understand you, and when you finally do, everything changes, not just the world around you, but the world inside you. Understanding yourself is the ending that finally sets your story free.